Can you imagine a single decision made in just 48 minutes, turning the tables on a global superpower? Picture this. France thought they could crush a small African nation with one financial blow. But what happened next didn't just shock the world. It rewrote the rules of power forever. The story we're about to tell you is one of the most remarkable displays of strategic brilliance in modern geopolitics. When France decided to freeze Burkina Faso's financial assets, over $327 million, they expected their former colony to come begging for mercy. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré's response was so unexpected, so audacious, that it didn't just save his nation. It changed the entire game of African independence forever. What happened next shocked European capitals, inspired millions across Africa, and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against financial warfare isn't money at all. This is the story of how one man turned France's greatest strength into their greatest weakness. France thought freezing Burkina Faso's money would bring Ibrahim Traoré to his knees. Instead, it made him more dangerous than ever. But the real question isn't what France did. It's what happened in the 48 minutes that followed, and how a single decision in a dusty office in Ouagadougou would send shockwaves through the halls of power in Paris, London, and Brussels. At exactly 9:17 a.m. on a Monday morning that would forever change the trajectory of West African politics, a confidential communiqué was transmitted from the French Ministry of Finance to four major European banks. The message itself was deceptively simple, barely 3 lines of diplomatic language that belied its devastating intent. All financial assets linked to the Burkina Faso Central Reserve are to be immediately frozen, pending further diplomatic clarification. The bureaucratic language was deliberately vague, but its meaning was crystal clear to anyone who understood the intricate web of financial control that France maintained over its former colonies. What followed, within just 30 minutes, was a cascade of economic devastation that rippled through every sector of Burkina Faso's economy. Block transactions began piling up in banking systems across Ouagadougou. Government programs that had been scheduled to receive funding found their accounts suddenly empty. Import licenses for essential goods, medicine, fuel, agricultural equipment were suspended as payment mechanisms ground to a halt. Over $327 million in reserves, money that represented months of careful economic planning and the hopes of millions of Burkinabe, suddenly vanished from the nation's reach, as if it had never existed. For the strategists in Paris, this was chess played at the highest level, a calculated move designed to achieve maximum pressure with minimal international scrutiny. No dramatic military interventions that would attract unwanted media attention. No economic sanctions that required lengthy justifications at the United Nations. Just numbers disappearing from computer screens, transactions failing to process, and a steady tightening of the financial noose around a defiant former colony's neck. The French officials who orchestrated this move were confident in their assessment. Ibrahim Traoré, faced with economic collapse and unable to pay his own military or provide basic services to his people, would come crawling back to accept whatever terms France offered. But they had fundamentally miscalculated the man they were dealing with. In their comfortable offices overlooking the Seine, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wealth built on the backs of African resources, they have forgotten something crucial about the nature of power. They have forgotten that true strength doesn't come from numbers on a screen. It comes from the ground beneath your feet and the will to defend what's rightfully yours. The French had made their move, assuming they were playing against a conventional African leader, someone who could be intimidated by financial pressure and brought to heel through economic warfare. They were about to discover that Ibrahim Traoré was anything but conventional. 48 minutes after those devastating commands had been transmitted from Paris, in a dimly lit room deep within the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat in absolute silence. The room was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity. No ornate decorations, no symbols of power, just functional furniture and the weight of a nation's future pressing down on everyone present. Around him, his advisors and ministers fidgeted nervously, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation they all understood, but none dared to fully articulate. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of Ouagadougou's bustling streets, where millions of Burkinabe went about their daily lives, unaware that their economic future had just been held hostage by a former colonial power thousands of miles away. Traoré held a small tablet in his hands, its screen displaying a cascade of blocked transactions and frozen accounts that told the story of France's financial assault. His expression was unreadable, but those who knew him well could see the gears turning behind his calm exterior. Finally, one advisor, his chief economic strategist, a man who had spent sleepless nights crafting the delicate financial balancing act that kept Burkina Faso's economy functioning, dared to break the silence. His voice trembled slightly as he laid out the harsh mathematics of their situation. Mr. President, we can't pay fuel subsidies after Wednesday. The transportation sector will grind to a halt. We'll lose access to our IMF buffer funds. International creditors will start calling in loans we can't service. By next month, we won't be able to pay government salaries, the military, the teachers, the healthcare workers. None of them will face civil unrest, economic collapse, possibly even a military coup. We need to find a way to negotiate with Paris, to give them something they want in exchange for unfreezing our assets. The advisor's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Without access to their foreign reserves, Burkina Faso would face the kind of economic catastrophe that had brought down governments across Africa. The French, in their cold calculation, had struck at the very heart of modern state power, the ability to move money, to pay bills, to maintain the basic functions of government in an interconnected global economy. But Traoré's response was not what anyone expected. He didn't rage against the injustice. He didn't order desperate diplomatic overtures to Paris. Instead, he interrupted his advisor with a question so simple, so fundamental, that it cut through all the complex financial maneuvering like a blade through silk. Who owns our gold mines? The room fell completely silent. The question seemed almost absurd in the context of their immediate crisis. What did gold mines matter when they couldn't access their bank accounts? What good were natural resources when international financial systems had locked them out? But as the seconds ticked by, the profound implications of Traoré's question began to dawn on everyone present. Then he stood up, his movement deliberate and purposeful, and spoke words that would be remembered for generations to come. They froze our virtual wealth, he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that commanded absolute attention. Let's remind them of our real wealth. What happened next will become the stuff of legend, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the entire African continent and beyond. The next morning, Burkina woke up expecting to see their president on television delivering a conventional address from behind the familiar podium of the presidential palace. Instead, they found themselves watching something unprecedented in the history of African leadership. Traoré was standing deep underground, in the heart of one of Burkina Faso's most productive gold mines. He wore not the formal suit of a head of state, but the practical helmet and work clothes of a miner. Dust covered his uniform, and the lighting was harsh and industrial, a stark contrast to the polished presentation of most political broadcasts. Behind him, real workers continued their shifts, their presence lending authenticity to a message that would resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet intensity that had filled the presidential palace the day before, but now it was amplified by the symbolism of his location and the power of his message. My fellow Burkinabe, they have taken what is ours on paper, he began, his eyes reflecting not defeat, but a burning determination that seemed to illuminate the dimly lit mine shaft. But we are taking back what is ours in the ground. Effective immediately, all foreign mining licenses are suspended. We will audit every ounce of gold that comes from our soil, every gram of manganese, every barrel of oil. We will account for every resource that belongs to the people of Burkina Faso. Our nation is no longer for sale to the highest bidder. The broadcast was unlike anything anyone had ever seen from an African leader. There were no empty promises, no appeals to international bodies, no diplomatic language designed to avoid offense. Instead, there was raw authenticity, a leader literally standing in the source of his nation's wealth and declaring that the age of resource extraction without proper compensation was over. But Traoré wasn't finished. As the cameras continued to roll, he walked deeper into the mine, past workers who nodded respectfully as he passed, past equipment that represented millions of dollars in foreign investment, past the very machinery that had been extracting Burkina Faso's wealth for the benefit of others for too long. He continued, his voice echoing off the mine walls. We have allowed others to take our gold and give us paper in return. We have been told that this paper, these bank accounts, these foreign reserves, represent security, represents progress. But today, we have learned what this paper is really worth. Today, we have seen how quickly it can disappear, how easily it can be taken away by those who never earned it in the first place. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, both for his immediate television audience and for the international viewers who were already beginning to take notice of this extraordinary broadcast. But they cannot freeze our gold. They cannot suspend our minds. They cannot take away the wealth that lies beneath our feet and the strength that lies within our people. So let them keep their paper. We will build our future on something more solid. The clip went viral within hours. First on African television networks, where news anchors struggled to find precedent for what they had just witnessed. Then on social media platforms, where hashtags like #RealGold, #TrailReclange, and #BurkinaRising began trending across multiple continents. TikTok videos recreated Traoré's mine shaft speech. Twitter threads analyzed the implications of his resource nationalization announcement. Instagram posts celebrated what many saw as a long overdue assertion of African dignity and self-determination. For 72 hours straight, Ibrahim Traoré dominated global conversation in a way that no African leader had managed in decades. This wasn't the usual coverage of conflict or poverty that typically brought international attention to the continent. This was something entirely different. A story of strategic brilliance, of turning weakness into strength, of using an opponent attack as a foundation for something unprecedented. But what the world was seeing was just the beginning. While international media focused on the symbolism of Traoré's mine shaft broadcast, something far more significant was happening behind the scenes. France had played chess, moving pieces on a board they thought they controlled. But Traoré was playing Go, a game where the goal isn't to capture pieces, but to control territory, where apparent defeats can become a foundation for overwhelming victory. 48 hours after his underground broadcast, the French ambassador to Burkina Faso, a career diplomat who had served in multiple African postings and prided himself on understanding the political dynamics of the region, demanded an emergency meeting with President Traoré. The ambassador had been instructed by Paris to offer a face-saving compromise, partial unfreezing of assets in exchange for guarantees about foreign mining investments and a return to more conventional economic policies. But when the ambassador arrived at the presidential palace, he was informed that Traoré wasn't in the capital. In fact, the president had left Burkina Faso entirely, flying unannounced to Bamako, Mali, for what his staff described only as urgent regional consultations. The French diplomatic corps was caught completely off guard. Their intelligence networks, despite decades of monitoring African political movements, had detected no advance warning of this trip. What they discovered 24 hours later sent shockwaves through European capitals. Traoré hadn't just flown to Mali for bilateral discussions. He had orchestrated a trilateral summit with the presidents of Mali and Niger, two other Sahel nations that had their own complicated relationships with France and their own grievances about economic exploitation and foreign interference. The three leaders met, not in a formal summit hall, but in a conference room overlooking Bamako's bustling markets, surrounded by the sounds and sights of authentic African commerce that had thrived long before European colonization and would continue long after. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. Three African leaders charting their economic future in the heart of African enterprise, away from the sterile conference rooms where their nation's fates had so often been decided by others. What they signed would later be called the Sékou Agreement by the Financial Times, named after the legendary Sékou Touré of Guinea, who had famously chosen poverty over colonial submission decades earlier. But unlike Touré's symbolic gesture, this agreement was built on practical power. The three presidents pledged to create a trilateral economic shield, sharing gold reserves, creating mutual trade flow protections, and establishing a regional emergency bank that would be completely independent of European financial systems. The agreement was remarkable not just for its ambition, but for its practicality. Shared gold reserves would be physically distributed across secure facilities in all three nations, making it impossible for any foreign power to freeze or manipulate them. Trade flows between the three countries will be conducted using a barter system backed by resource reserves, eliminating dependence on foreign currencies that could be manipulated by external powers. The Regional Emergency Bank would maintain physical gold, reserves equal to at least 6 months of combined government operations for all three nations. But the most revolutionary aspect of the agreement was its transparency mechanism. All gold reserves, all resource flows, all financial transactions will be recorded on an open-source blockchain system that any citizen of any of the three nations could access and verify. This wasn't just economic independence. It was economic democracy on a scale never before attempted. France's financial freeze, intended to isolate and weaken Burkina Faso, had instead catalyzed the creation of the most independent and transparent economic alliance in African history. 3 Sahel nations, controlling vast mineral wealth and strategic geographic positions, were building a new financial front that could potentially reshape the entire economic landscape of West Africa. The implications were staggering. If successful, the SECO agreement could serve as a model for other African nations seeking to escape the web of financial dependence that had characterized the post-colonial era. European mining companies, which had grown accustomed to extracting African resources at below-market rates, would face coordinated resistance from nations that controlled significant portions of global gold, uranium, and rare earth mineral reserves. But perhaps most significantly, the agreement represented a new kind of African leadership, pragmatic rather than rhetorical, strategic rather than reactive, focused on building alternative systems rather than simply criticizing existing ones. Traoré and his counterparts weren't just declaring independence from French economic control. They were actually constructing the infrastructure to make that independence sustainable. The international response was swift and dramatic. Within a week of the SECO agreement's announcement, European mining corporations began hemorrhaging stock value as investors grappled with the implications of resource nationalization across multiple African nations simultaneously. At mining sites across the three countries, workers who had been unpaid due to the financial freeze organized protests that quickly spread beyond labor disputes to become broader demonstrations of support for economic independence. International media, initially skeptical of what seemed like another grandiose African political gesture, began to take serious notice as the practical implications of the agreement became clear. This wasn't symbolic politics. It was economic warfare, conducted with surgical precision. The Financial Times published a lengthy analysis titled The SECO Revolution: How Three African Nations May Have Changed the Game Forever. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story examining the potential global implications of resource-backed alternative currencies. Even skeptical European publications acknowledged that something unprecedented was happening in the Sahel. But the most significant development came, not from international media coverage, but from a leak that would transform the entire narrative around France's actions. A French intelligence memo, dated 4 weeks before the financial freeze, was obtained by investigative journalists and revealed the calculating cynicism behind France's strategy. The memo, marked confidential diffusion restraint, outlined a comprehensive plan to provoke financial instability across the Sahel region. The goal wasn't simply to punish Burkina Faso for its independent foreign policy, but to create a crisis that would force all 3 Sahel nations to accept renewed French economic oversight. The plan explicitly called for coordinated financial pressure, support for political opposition groups, and the strategic manipulation of international aid flows to create conditions where French intervention would appear necessary and welcome. When Al Jazeera broke the story under the headline, "The Neo-Colonial Playbook: How France Planned to Destabilize the Sahel," the damage to French credibility was devastating. The memo revealed not just the specific targeting of Burkina Faso, but a broader strategy of maintaining economic control over former colonies through financial manipulation and political interference. European allies, already uncomfortable with France's heavy-handed approach to African relations, distanced themselves from policies that now appeared nakedly neo-colonial. The leak fundamentally changed the international conversation. What had initially been portrayed as a legitimate response to concerning political developments in Burkina Faso was now exposed as part of a calculated campaign to maintain French economic dominance through destabilization and manipulation. Traoré didn't even need to respond to the revelations. The documents spoke for themselves, validating everything he had claimed about French interference and resource exploitation. But even as international opinion shifted in his favor, Traoré wasn't content to simply bask in vindication. He understood that media cycles are short, and that sustainable change requires building systems that outlast news headlines. What he did next would prove that his strategic thinking extended far beyond conventional political maneuvering. On the 10th day of the French financial freeze, as European officials quietly began discussions about how to walk back their failed strategy without losing face, Traoré gave a televised interview that would cement his reputation as one of the most innovative leaders of his generation. But this wasn't a conventional political interview designed to score rhetorical points against his opponents. Instead, it was something unprecedented in African political communication. The interview was conducted, not in French, the colonial language that had dominated African political discourse for generations, but in more Traoré's native language and one of the most widely spoken languages in Burkina Faso. The decision was deliberately symbolic, a rejection of linguistic colonialism, and an assertion that African leaders could communicate with their people in their own voices, using their own words, expressing concepts that might not even exist in European languages. But the content of the interview was even more revolutionary than its language. Speaking directly to his people in words they could understand without translation, Traoré announced the next phase of what was rapidly becoming known as the Burkina Faso model of economic independence. Our new regional bank, he announced, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had characterized all his public statements, will be backed, not by the euro, not by the dollar, not by any currency controlled by those who have exploited us for generations. It will be backed by our gold reserves, verified, not by foreign auditors who answer to foreign governments, but by drone scans and satellite imaging that our own technicians control and our own people can access. The implications were staggering. Traditional banking systems, even when controlled by developing nations, ultimately depended on integration with global financial networks that remained dominated by former colonial powers. Traoré was proposing something entirely different, a monetary system based on verified physical resources that couldn't be manipulated by external actors. But he wasn't finished. As the cameras continued to roll, broadcasting his words, not just across Burkina Faso, but to African diaspora communities around the world who were following the story with growing excitement, Traoré unveiled what he called the People's Ledger. We are digitizing our land, he explained, using simple language that any citizen could understand. Every gram of gold that comes from our soil will be accounted for. Every mineral that belongs to our people will be tracked from the moment it leaves the ground until the moment it contributes to our national development. And every citizen of Burkina Faso will have access to this information. You will know exactly what wealth comes from your land, exactly how it is being used, exactly how it benefits your community. The People's Ledger was more than just an accounting system. It was a complete reimagining of the relationship between citizens and their natural resources. Using blockchain technology, every transaction involving Burkina Faso's mineral wealth will be recorded in a public database that any citizen could access from their mobile phone. Citizens would be able to track the gold mine in their region, see how much revenue it generated, and verify that appropriate portions were being invested in local development projects. But Traoré took the concept even further. Every citizen would be assigned a unique identifier in the system, and every citizen would receive a direct quarterly dividend based on the nation's resource extraction, not a government handout subject to political manipulation, but an algorithmic distribution based on verified resource revenues that no politician could alter or withhold. Even cryptocurrency analysts from Silicon Valley, initially skeptical of what seemed like a gimmicky political gesture, began taking serious notice as technical details of the system were released. The blockchain architecture was sophisticated, incorporating multiple verification layers and redundant security systems. The satellite imaging integration was cutting edge, using advanced algorithms to track mining activity in real time. The citizen interface was intuitive and accessible, designed to work on basic smartphones, even in areas with limited internet connectivity. Forbes published an analysis titled, "The Blockchain Revolution Africa Didn't See Coming," examining how Burkina Faso's resource transparency system could become a model for developing nations around the world. TechCrunch ran a lengthy piece on the technical innovation behind the People's Ledger, noting that even developed nations had failed to achieve the level of government transparency that Traoré was implementing. Harvard Business Review published a case study examining how the system could revolutionize resource governance in developing countries. The international development community, initially skeptical of what appeared to be a publicity stunt, began to recognize that something genuinely unprecedented was happening. The World Bank, despite political pressure from major donor countries, quietly began studying the Burkina Faso model as a potential framework for improving governance in resource-rich developing nations. United Nations officials, speaking off the record, acknowledged that Traoré's transparency initiatives went far beyond anything attempted by previous African leaders. But perhaps most significantly, the system was actually working. Within weeks of its implementation, citizens across Burkina Faso were accessing the People's Ledger from their phones, tracking resource extraction in their regions, and verifying that promised development projects were actually being funded and implemented. For the first time in their nation's history, ordinary Burkinabe had direct, verifiable access to information about their country's mineral wealth and how it was being used. France hadn't just failed to intimidate Traoré. They had inadvertently inspired the creation of the world's most transparent resource-based economy, a system that other African nations were already beginning to study and adapt for their own circumstances. The financial freeze that was supposed to bring Burkina Faso to its knees had instead catalyzed the most significant innovation in African governance since independence. The reversal of French strategy was swift and humiliating. Without any formal announcement, without any diplomatic ceremony or face-saving explanation, France quietly lifted the financial freeze. Banking systems that had blocked Burkina Faso's transactions suddenly resumed normal operations. Frozen accounts were unfrozen. International payment systems that had been suspended were reactivated. French officials, when pressed by international media, offered only terse statements about improved diplomatic cooperation and constructive dialogue with regional partners. There was no apology for the economic damage caused by the freeze. There was no acknowledgement that the strategy had backfired spectacularly. There was no explanation for why a policy that had been justified as necessary for regional stability was suddenly abandoned without achieving any of its stated objectives. The silence from Paris spoke volumes. For a government that had grown accustomed to dictating terms to its former colonies, the inability to force Burkina Faso into submission represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The financial weapons that had been used successfully for decades to maintain French influence in Africa had not only failed, they had strengthened the very independence movement they were designed to crush. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré found himself transformed from a regional leader dealing with domestic challenges to a global symbol of resistance and innovation. Invitations poured in from around the world. The African Union invited him to deliver a keynote address at their annual summit. The BRICS Plus nations, always interested in alternatives to Western-dominated financial systems, requested his participation in their Economic Development Conference. Universities from Harvard to Oxford to the London School of Economics invited him to speak about his resource governance innovations. But these weren't the typical ceremonial invitations extended to African leaders as diplomatic courtesy. These were substantive requests from serious institutions that recognized that something genuinely important was happening in Burkina Faso. Traoré wasn't being invited as a representative of African symbolism. He was being invited as an innovator whose ideas could have global applications. His address to the African Union was particularly significant. Speaking to an audience of African leaders who had struggled for decades with the challenge of converting resource wealth into sustainable development, Traoré laid out a comprehensive vision for African economic independence that went far beyond his own nation's circumstances. For too long, he told the assembled heads of state, we have accepted that our role in the global economy is to provide raw materials to others and then purchase finished goods at prices they determine. We have accepted that our wealth must flow through financial systems we do not control, subject to rules we did not write, vulnerable to manipulation by those who see us as competitors to be contained rather than partners to be respected. He paused, allow his words to resonate with leaders who had all, in their own ways, experienced the frustrations of navigating international systems designed to maintain existing power imbalances. But we are not condemned to perpetual dependence. We control resources that the world needs. We possess human capital that can innovate and create. We have the technological tools to build transparent, accountable systems that serve our people rather than foreign interests. The question is not whether we can achieve independence. The question is whether we have the courage to seize it. The response was electric. These weren't abstract concepts or rhetorical flourishes. These were practical strategies that Traoré had already proven could work. Other African leaders began approaching him privately, asking for technical assistance in implementing similar transparency systems in their own countries. Mining companies that had grown comfortable with opaque resource extraction found themselves facing demands for accountability from governments that had previously been passive partners. Within 6 months of the SECO agreement signing, Ghana announced plans to implement a modified version of the People's Ledger for their gold mining sector. Nigeria began developing a blockchain-based system for tracking oil revenues. The Democratic Republic of Congo initiated discussions about creating a regional cobalt mining transparency network. What had started as Burkina Faso's desperate response to financial warfare was becoming a continental movement toward resource sovereignty and economic transparency. The transformation wasn't limited to government initiatives. Civil society organizations across Africa began demanding similar transparency from their own governments. Student movements organized around the principle that citizens had a right to know exactly how their nation's resources were being used. Traditional rulers, whose communities often sat atop valuable mineral deposits, began asserting their right to direct participation in resource extraction agreements. The BRICS Plus conference was equally significant, but for different reasons. Speaking to an audience that included leaders from China, Russia, India, and Brazil, nations that had their own complicated relationships with Western financial systems, Traoré presented his resource-backed transparency model as a potential framework for broader alternatives to dollar-dominated international trade. We have proven, he told the conference, that it is possible to build financial systems based on verified physical wealth rather than fiat currencies subject to political manipulation. We have shown that developing nations can use technology to create transparency that exceeds what exists in developed countries. We have demonstrated that economic independence is not a dream. It is an achievable goal for any nation with the resources and the will to pursue it. The implications extended far beyond Africa. If resource-rich developing nations could successfully implement Traoré's model, it could fundamentally alter global economic relationships. No longer would these nations be forced to accept whatever terms were offered by international financial institutions. No longer would their resources be extracted at below-market rates by foreign corporations operating under opaque agreements. No longer would their economic policies be subject to external manipulation through financial pressure. Chinese officials, while maintaining diplomatic neutrality, quietly began studying the SECO agreement as a potential model for their Belt and Road Initiative partnerships. Russian energy companies, facing their own sanctions-related financial restrictions, expressed interest in resource-backed trading systems that bypass traditional Western financial networks. Indian technology firms offered to provide technical assistance for implementing blockchain-based transparency systems in other developing nations. The European Union, meanwhile, found itself scrambling to respond to a rapidly changing landscape. Traditional development aid programs, often criticized for creating dependence rather than fostering genuine development, suddenly appeared antiquated compared to Traoré's model of transparent resource sovereignty. European mining companies, accustomed to negotiating with individual African nations from positions of strength, now face the prospect of dealing with coordinated regional blocs that maintain detailed public records of all resource extraction activities. But perhaps most importantly, Traoré had demonstrated that African leadership could be innovative rather than reactive, strategic rather than defensive, focus on building alternatives rather than simply criticizing existing systems. He wasn't just resisting Western economic dominance. He was offering a practical alternative that other nations could study, adapt, and implement according to their own circumstances and capabilities. The transformation was remarkable, not just in its scope, but in its speed. In less than 3 months, Traoré had gone from being a regional leader dealing with a financial crisis to becoming a global symbol of innovative governance and economic independence. France's attempt to crush his independence had instead amplified his influence far beyond what any conventional diplomatic or economic success could have achieved. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso's response to French financial warfare became more than just a geopolitical case study. It became a template for how small nations could leverage their assets, their principles, and their technological capabilities to resist pressure from much larger powers. The lessons extended far beyond Africa, offering insights relevant to any country seeking to maintain its independence in an interconnected world dominated by a few major powers. But what made the story truly compelling wasn't just a successful outcome. It was a demonstration that strategic thinking, principled leadership, and innovative use of technology could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. France had every advantage in their confrontation with Burkina Faso: superior financial resources, established international relationships, sophisticated diplomatic networks, and decades of experience in manipulating African political dynamics. Yet, they had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by a leader who understood that true power comes not from controlling existing systems, but from having the vision and courage to build better ones. The question that emerged from Traoré's triumph wasn't just about African independence or French neocolonialism. It was about the nature of power itself in the modern world. In an age when economic warfare is conducted through computer networks and diplomatic pressure is applied through financial systems, Traoré had proven that the most effective resistance comes not from opposing force with force, but from changing the rules of the game entirely. His innovation went beyond clever policymaking or diplomatic maneuvering. He had fundamentally redefined what it meant to be a sovereign nation in the 21st century. Rather than accepting that sovereignty meant playing by rules written by others, he had demonstrated that true sovereignty meant having the capability and will to write your own rules and to build the systems necessary to enforce them. 1 year after the financial freeze that was supposed to bring him to his knees, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly, not as a supplicant seeking international support, but as an innovator sharing a model that had already inspired dozens of other nations. His speech that day would be remembered not for its rhetoric, but for its practicality, a detailed explanation of how any nation could implement transparent, accountable resource governance systems that serve their people rather than foreign interests. "We are not asking for your permission to be free," he told the assembled delegates, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had characterized his response to the French financial freeze. "We are showing you that freedom is not something that can be granted or taken away by others. It is something you build for yourself, one transparent transaction at a time, one accountable institution at a time, one empowered citizen at a time." The applause that followed wasn't the polite diplomatic recognition typically accorded to African leaders at international forums. It was genuine enthusiasm from delegates who recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented, an African leader who had not only successfully resisted external pressure, but had transformed that pressure into the foundation for something genuinely innovative and inspiring. Oh, what would you have done if a superpower had frozen your nation's future, cut off your access to the financial systems that modern governments depend on, and expected you to surrender your principles in exchange for the restoration of their artificial constraints? Would you have accepted their terms, negotiated for partial relief, and returned to the dependent relationship they preferred? Would you have raged against the injustice while remaining trapped within the systems they controlled? Or would you have had the vision to see beyond their temporary advantage, the creativity to build something they couldn't touch, and the courage to transform their attack into the foundation of your independence? Ibrahim Traoré chose transformation over submission, innovation over reaction, and strategic thinking over emotional response. His choice didn't just save Burkina Faso from economic disaster. It created a new model for how nations can maintain their dignity and independence in a world where economic warfare has replaced military conquest as a preferred tool of international domination. The world is still catching up to what Traoré accomplished in those crucial weeks when France thought they held all the cards. His response revealed not just the limitations of financial coercion as a tool of international relations, but the untapped potential of principled leadership combined with technological innovation and strategic thinking. In an age when many assumed that small nations had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered by larger powers, Traoré proved that there's always another choice if you're willing to build it yourself. The legacy of those 48 minutes continues to unfold across Africa and beyond, inspiring leaders and citizens who understand that true independence isn't just about political freedom. It's about economic sovereignty, technological capability, and the unwavering determination to build systems that serve your people rather than foreign interests. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré's greatest victory wasn't just defeating France's financial warfare. It was proving that the future belongs to those bold enough to create it. 6 months after his UN address, an unexpected invitation arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. It wasn't from another African leader or international organization, but from a consortium of Silicon Valley technology companies led by some of the most influential figures in the global tech industry. They wanted to visit Burkina Faso, not to offer aid or investment, but to study the people's ledger system that had captured their attention as potentially the most advanced implementation of blockchain technology for governance anywhere in the world. The delegation that arrived in Ouagadougou read like a who's who of technological innovation. Venture capitalists who had funded the most successful startups of the past decade, software engineers who had built the platforms that billions of people use daily, cryptocurrency pioneers who had been working for years to create transparent, decentralized systems. They came not as benefactors offering to help a developing nation, but as students seeking to learn from what they recognized as a genuinely revolutionary approach to digital governance. The meetings that followed were unlike any diplomatic encounters in African history. Instead of the usual discussions about aid packages and development programs, these were technical deep dives into algorithmic governance, decentralized verification systems, and the practical challenges of implementing radical transparency at scale. Traoré, flanked by his team of local software engineers and systems architects, found himself in the unusual position of teaching Silicon Valley executives about innovations they wished they had thought of first. "We've been trying to solve the problem of trust in digital systems for decades," admitted one of the visiting venture capitalists during a private dinner at the presidential residence. "We've built blockchain systems for cryptocurrency, for supply chain management, for digital contracts, but we never thought to apply these technologies to something as fundamental as resource governance and citizen participation in economic policy. You've achieved something we've been theorizing about for years." But what impressed the Silicon Valley delegation most wasn't just the technical sophistication of the People's Ledger. It was its practical success. In less than a year, the system had processed over 50,000 individual transactions, tracked the extraction and distribution of 2.3 tons of gold, and distributed direct dividends to over 8 million Burkinabe citizens. The system had achieved 99.7% uptime, despite being implemented in a country with limited technological infrastructure, and citizen satisfaction surveys showed approval ratings above 85% for the transparency initiatives. The visit had an immediate impact that extended far beyond diplomatic courtesy. Within weeks of return to California, several of the visiting tech executives began quietly restructuring their own companies to implement transparency measures inspired by the Burkina Faso model. Internal financial flows that had been proprietary corporate secrets for decades were suddenly made available to employees and shareholders. Resource utilization data that had been closely guarded was published in real-time dashboards accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The corporate world watched with fascination and concern, as some of the most successful technology companies in history voluntarily adopted levels of transparency that exceeded what most governments provided to their citizens. Stock markets initially reacted with nervousness to this unprecedented corporate openness. But something unexpected happened. Companies that implemented Traoré-inspired transparency measures saw their stock prices rise rather than fall. Investors, accustomed to making decisions based on limited and carefully curated information, found themselves able to make more informed choices based on comprehensive real-time data. The phenomenon spread beyond technology companies. Mining corporations, under pressure from shareholders who had learned about resource transparency possibilities from the Burkina Faso example, began implementing their own public ledger systems. Energy companies, facing scrutiny from environmental groups and regulators, adopted real-time emissions tracking based on blockchain verification. Even financial institutions, historically among the most secretive industries in the world, began experimenting with public transaction logs for certain types of activities. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré watched these developments with the same strategic patience he had shown during the financial crisis. He understood that the most powerful revolutions aren't imposed from above. They spread naturally when people see better alternatives to existing systems. His goal had never been to export the Burkina Faso model to other countries, but to prove that radical transparency and economic sovereignty were possible. Now, corporations and government around the world were voluntarily adopting elements of his approach because they could see its practical benefits. The success of the People's Ledger also caught the attention of academic institutions worldwide. Universities that had been studying blockchain technology primarily as a theoretical exercise suddenly found themselves confronted with a real-world implementation that was generating measurable results. Economics departments that had spent decades analyzing resource curse theory now had a functioning example of how technology could be used to convert natural resource wealth into sustainable development. MIT announced the creation of the Traoré Institute for Digital Governance, a research center focused on studying technological approaches to transparent resource management. Harvard Business School added a case study on the Burkina Faso model to its required curriculum for MBA students. The London School of Economics established a partnership with the University of Ouagadougou to jointly research the economic impacts of radical transparency in resource-rich developing nations. But these weren't typical North-South academic relationships, where Western institutions studied African developments as exotic curiosities. Instead, they were genuine partnerships where African scholars and practitioners were recognized as leading experts in a field they had essentially created. Graduate students from around the world began applying to study in Ouagadougou, seeking to learn from the engineers and economists who had built the world's most advanced resource transparency system. The intellectual flow wasn't unidirectional. Burkina Faso's experience with implementing radical transparency had generated insights that were relevant to governance challenges in developed countries as well. American cities struggling with budget transparency began adopting modified versions of the People's Ledger for municipal spending. European environmental agencies implemented real-time pollution tracking systems based on Burkina Faso's mining oversight algorithms. Canadian provinces experimented with citizen dividend systems inspired by Traoré's resource revenue distribution model. The success of the Burkina Faso model inspired what economists would later call the second wave of African innovation. Unlike the first wave, which had focused primarily on mobile telecommunications and financial services, this second wave was characterized by comprehensive approaches to governance, resource management, and citizen participation in economic policy. Ghana's implementation of the People's Ledger for gold mining generated $2.3 billion in additional government revenue in its first year, simply by providing accurate accounting of extraction volumes and eliminating the discrepancies that had previously allowed significant revenue leakage. Nigeria's Oil Transparency Initiative, while more complex due to the scale of the petroleum sector, succeeded in reducing corruption-related losses by an estimated 40% within 18 months of implementation. The Democratic Republic of Congo, despite ongoing security challenges in some regions, managed to implement a cobalt mining transparency system that gave international electronics manufacturers unprecedented visibility into their supply chains. For the first time, consumers could scan a QR code on their smartphones and see exactly which mines had provided the cobalt in their device's battery, what working conditions were like at those mines, and how much revenue had been generated for local communities. But the most dramatic success came from an unexpected source. Rwanda, a small landlocked nation with limited natural resources, adapted the Traoré model to create a comprehensive economic transparency system that covered everything from coffee exports to tourism revenue to foreign aid utilization. The Rwanda version of the People's Ledger became so comprehensive and user-friendly that it was adopted as a best practice model by the World Bank and recommended for implementation in other small developing nations. By the second anniversary of the French financial freeze, the geopolitical implications of Traoré's revolution had become impossible to ignore. The success of the SECO agreement had inspired similar regional partnerships across Africa. The East African Community announced plans for a shared resource transparency network. West African nations began coordinating their positions in negotiations with international mining companies. Even North African countries, despite their different economic structures and political systems, began exploring ways to implement elements of the transparency model for their oil and gas sectors. The cumulative effect was a fundamental shift in the balance of power between African nations and their traditional external partners. European companies that had grown accustomed to extracting African resources under favorable terms negotiated decades earlier found themselves dealing with governments that maintained detailed public records of all resource flows and were accountable to citizens who could verify those records in real time. The shift was perhaps most dramatic in the diamond industry. For generations, diamond mining in Africa had been characterized by opaque agreements, disputed valuations, and significant revenue leakage. But when several African diamond-producing nations implemented Traoré-inspired transparency systems, the industry was forced to adapt rapidly. Diamond buyers, who had previously been able to purchase stones at below-market rates, suddenly found themselves competing in transparent auctions where every transaction was recorded on public ledgers. The change wasn't limited to extractive industries. Agricultural exports, textile manufacturing, and even tourism revenue became subject to new levels of transparency and accountability. African nations that had previously competed against each other for foreign investment began coordinating their policies to ensure that international partners contributed fairly to national development rather than simply extracting value. France's response to these developments was complex and often contradictory. Publicly, French officials praised the innovations in governance and transparency that were emerging across former French colonies. President Emmanuel Macron's successors spoke frequently about the importance of African economic development and France's commitment to supporting African innovations. But privately, French corporations and government agencies struggled to adapt to a dramatically changed landscape. Mining companies that operated in West Africa for decades found their profit margins squeezed by new transparency requirements and fair value pricing mechanisms. French banks that had facilitated resource extraction under the old system found themselves excluded from transactions that were now conducted through regional African financial networks. The French intelligence services, meanwhile, attempted to adapt their influence operations to the new technological realities. They invested heavily in cybersecurity capabilities designed to disrupt blockchain networks and transparency systems. They funded opposition political movements that campaigned against radical transparency as a threat to business privacy and economic competitiveness. They even attempted to recruit technical experts who could find vulnerabilities in the people's ledger system. But these efforts largely failed, not because of superior African cybersecurity, but because of the decentralized nature of the systems Traoré had inspired. Unlike traditional government systems that could be disrupted by targeting central servers or key personnel, the blockchain-based transparency networks were distributed across thousands of nodes in multiple countries. Attacking one part of the system only strengthened the others by demonstrating the need for redundancy and security. More importantly, any successful attack on the transparency systems would have been immediately visible to millions of citizens who use the platforms daily. The French intelligence services discovered that, in the age of radical transparency, even sophisticated covert operations became nearly impossible to hide from populations that had grown accustomed to verifying information independently. 3 years after those crucial 48 minutes in the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood once again in the same sparse room where he had made the decision that would reshape African economics. But this time, he wasn't alone. Around the table sat the presidents of 12 African nations, the CEOs of major technology companies, officials from international development organizations, and representatives from civil society groups across the continent. They were gathered to sign what would become known as the Ouagadougou Accords, a comprehensive framework for implementing transparent resource governance systems across the developing world. The document they were about to sign represented the culmination of everything that had begun with France's failed attempt to pressure Burkina Faso through financial warfare. The accords weren't just about Africa. They included commitments from Latin American nations rich in lithium and rare earth minerals. They incorporated agreements with Pacific Island nations seeking to manage their fisheries resources more effectively. They even included partnerships with certain developed nations that wanted to implement citizen dividend systems based on natural resource revenues. As he prepared to sign the document that would institutionalize the governance revolution he had started, Traoré reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The French financial freeze that had seemed so devastating 3 years earlier now appeared to have been exactly the catalyst that was needed to break African nations out of cycles of dependence and exploitation that had persisted for generations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the transformation wasn't its scope or its success. It was its sustainability. Unlike previous African development initiatives that had depended on external funding and support, the systems inspired by the Burkina Faso model were self-sustaining. They generated their own revenue through more efficient resource management. They built their own technological capacity through education and training programs. They created their own political momentum through citizen participation and accountability. The question that had driven Traoré during those crucial 48 minutes, who owns our gold mines, had evolved into something broader and more profound. Who controls the systems that determine how our nations develop and our people prosper? The answer, demonstrated through 3 years of successful implementation, was clear. The people themselves, when given the tools and information they need to hold their leaders accountable and participate. Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about justice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.